Hello, I'm Victoria Tunsing, and welcome to Afterword. I'm interviewing John Yoo, law professor, visiting scholar for the American Institute, American Enterprise Institute, former Deputy Assistant Attorney General for the Justice Department. I had a similar position, but it was a few years before John's. And I was in the criminal division. He was in the Office of Legal Counsel. Author of 2 books on constitutional law and his years in the Bush Justice Department. And now, John, as I read Crisis in Command, A History of the Executive Power from George Washington to George W. Bush, I say presidential scholar and historian. I'm impressed.
Thank you.
Very and let me just tell you, I don't want to be like an undergraduate history professor that I had who only made it to World War I by the end of the semester. I want to get through all of this. We go through 5 presidents from Washington, Jefferson, Jackson, Lincoln, and FDR, and then through the Cold War presidencies. So I want to get through them all. So let's start.
Okay.
Let's start. And where better to start than on the concept of executive power. Article 2, Section 1. The executive power vests in the President of the United States. Now, but that wasn't just some phrase that they made up at the time. That had historical meaning for our framers in 1787. They had the philosophers, Locke, Blackstone, Montesquieu. Tell me about what concept did they have from the philosophers?
Yeah, this is the interesting thing is sometimes we tend to read the Constitution as it just emerged out of the head of Zeus, right? And actually the one thing I tried to do in the beginning of the book is to sort of place it all in context. And the idea of the executive, where did it come from? And one reason why that's important is, as you know, the first Constitution that we had in the country was the Articles of Confederation. There was no executive at all. There was just the Congress. So the presidency seems like this radical innovation in American constitutional law. But actually, as you say, it has long antecedents. And actually, I think the fellow to start with is Machiavelli, who really thought, I think in a way...
I left him out of the list because I thought it might taint it.
No, I mean, I think this area, the book, is sort of heavily influenced by the work of Harvey Mansfield, the political theorist at Harvard. And in his book, he really points out how Machiavelli first thought of the fundamental tension that runs throughout the book, which is you have a legislature, it writes laws, but those laws can't anticipate the future. They can't take care of every contingency. Government needs to have somebody in being that can react quickly and immediately to unforeseen emergencies and circumstances.
But our framers had also seen how executive power was carried out in Europe because it was all monarchies.
Yes.
So then they were staying away from it.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. One thing that people don't see, and I think you see, is that executive power comes and goes, and there was a kind of cycle. And we shouldn't confuse the revolution with the Constitution. The revolution was definitely a rebellion against what the framers saw as an powerful executive. But then they went totally the other way. It was almost, they decided to go the exact opposite and to have state constitutions, which gave huge power to the legislature, to the point where my original home state of Pennsylvania had a 12-member governorship.
Well, let's go to the Articles of Confederation since you mentioned them, because that was the other thing in our framers' minds. Oh my gosh, we really had this disaster.
Yes.
And it was schizophrenic in
Yes.
that they had too much power and not enough power.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Talk about that. I mean, so we're in the minds of when they were writing.
Right. So, part of what we try to do here is put ourselves back into the positions of the people who wrote the Constitution. What were they worried about? So, on the one level, they had just rebelled against the English king. But on the other hand, they saw the legislature, and they saw these overpowerful legislatures taking property, redistributing income without the check of an executive. And then they had Articles of Confederation, a weak national government with no executive at all.
Couldn't even raise taxes.
Could not fight
Regulate
wars.
commerce, couldn't do diddly squat.
Exactly.
So now they've torn that up, and here's what they know. They want to have 3 branches because they want some kind of check and balance system. And even in the legislature, which is the first branch, of course, they have 2 bodies. They break that up with a Senate and a House. They know what they want to have an executive. They know that they want to have a judiciary. And yet, all of these bodies not only have to be balanced against each other, but against the states.
Right. Right. In fact, Madison calls this the double security of the liberties of the people, is that the three branches would check each other, and then the federal government and the state governments would check each other too. And if you remember, Madison has this classic phrase where he says, the Constitution is designed to make ambition counter ambition, that each branch of government has its own self-interest, and we'll give them each different powers because they have different functions, but those powers will come into conflict, but actually that's what the framers wanted. That was the check.
I tried to explain it to my kids once when I was in law school, that it's the game of paper, scissors, rock.
Oh, that's a great, I never thought of that before. That's a great analogy, yeah.
But it just depends on what's happening, which one's going to win. And then they did something else that I found fascinating, and you write about. They got different terms for every one of these bodies. So the Senate has six years, but they're staggered.
Right.
The House has 2. The president in between has 4, and it was unlimited at the time. And the judiciary is lifetime.
Right.
I mean, how interesting that they never wanted the government to be replaced at once.
Right. The one thing is they thought that part of making sure there wasn't just a pure democracy, because they were also afraid of pure democracy,
Of course.
but also a government that was too distant from the people. They would have staggered terms for different institutions to give them different incentives, right? So the House, 2 years, they'd be the most immediate representatives of the passions of the people. But the presidency, 4 years was thought to be a check on that. And this it really goes to this point you just made about the re-electability. It's very interesting. Now we are accustomed no more than 2 terms. We have a constitutional amendment after FDR because of that. The framers, many of them thought that having constant re-eligibility, was no term limits for the president, was actually a good thing, because what they worried about was a president who would not constantly...
Who would not be answerable.
Yeah, right, who would not be answerable to the people, who would not have that connection. At the same time, they didn't want a president who was just looking out for short-term political gains and would not make the longer-term decisions that would be ultimately to the benefit of the country.
So they write Article 1, and they very carefully spell out, Congress, you can do this. And some things sound, kind of mundane, like you can make post offices and coin money, but they gave Congress some really powerful authority. What are the most impressive?
I think Congress's power over interstate commerce, which is now the great font for almost all federal regulation in the country.
We're going to get to that discussion.
But also the other big one, the power of the purse. Congress is the only branch that can pay for everything else the government does, and that is seen even at the time of the framing in the debates over the Constitution. The defenders of the Constitution, the Federalists, are out there saying, no matter what happens, if you're worried about the executive going overboard, the Congress always has the ultimate power of the purse and can always stop him.
But also, they might have thought it was a bigger power than we look at today, the power to declare war.
Yeah, they did say, Congress...
We're going to see as we go along
so
through the different
changes,
presidency what happens and what presidents think about.
Right. They thought that Congress, you couldn't have a war without Congress, because the United States had no standing military. Every war, in their mind then, you had to build an ad hoc military to fight that war.
Well, and that goes back to the power of the purse. Okay, so now Article 1, they're through with that one. Article 2, that's the president. They hadn't even decided whether there should be one president. I find that a fascinating debate that happened. And what was it that won the argument for a single president?
Well, this is a really interesting thing. Like, so people, sometimes they don't realize how much was in play as to the Constitution. As you say, it's fascinating when you go back and look, all the different things they might have done. So there were proposals to have multi-headed executive branch. There's a proposal to have a council of state that would have to advise and consent to all executive decisions. I mean, can you imagine what that would have been like? They had decisions. They had a lot of the powers the president now has were actually originally given to the Senate.
So what won the day?
I think as time went on during the Constitutional Convention, the Senate, part of it was that the Senate did not become the body people thought it was. It became the representative of the states. Once that decision is made in the convention, and that was really the deadlock issue of the convention, was where the state's going to have representation. Once that happens, the framers realize that we have to move these powers to an executive
somebody.
who's responsible to the people. And so the powers like over war, trees start to get transferred to the executive branch.